Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, I'm sharing 3 deeply unsettling stories from people who work one of the loneliest jobs imaginable: overnight custodians in empty schools. These massive buildings that are filled with noise and life during the day become something else entirely when the lights go out and everyone goes home. These aren't creepypasta tales or fictional horror stories. These are real experiences from real janitors who were just trying to do their jobs when they encountered something they couldn't explain. Before we begin, I want to know, have you ever been alone in a large building at night? A school, an office, a hospital? There's something profoundly unsettling about walking through spaces that are designed for crowds when you're the only person there. The echoes sound different. The shadows fall wrong. Every sound makes you freeze and listen. Drop a comment and let me know your experiences. And if you're watching this while working a night shift right now, stay alert. You never know what's in the next room. Alright, let's begin. Story 1. What lives in the basement? I used to work as a custodian at a middle school for almost 5 years, and I was usually assigned to the overnight shift. I'd clock in around 10 p.m. and stay until right before sunrise when the buses started pulling into the parking lot. At first, I actually liked the job. I didn't have to deal with kids running down the hallways, teachers complaining about classroom conditions, or really anyone at all. The quiet didn't bother me. I'm naturally introverted, and I liked being left alone to do my work at my own pace. But as time went on, I started to notice how fundamentally different the school felt at night compared to during the day. It wasn't just quiet. It felt dead. The building creaked and groaned like it was breathing, like it was a living thing settling into sleep. And when you're the only person in there, even the smallest sound will set you on edge. You'd hear a locker pop open on its own, or the pipes knocking in the walls, and your brain would convince you it was footsteps. Someone approaching from around the corner. I learned to ignore most of that. You have to, or you'd go crazy. But there was one part of the school I never really got used to, no matter how many times I had to go there. The basement. The school was old, built in the early 1950s, and the basement ran underneath about half the building. It wasn't finished nicely like the classrooms upstairs. It was a concrete maze of storage rooms and long, narrow corridors with exposed pipes and electrical wiring hanging overhead. Some of the rooms were packed with old desks stacked to the ceiling. Others had boxes of outdated textbooks from the 1970s and 80s that nobody wanted but nobody had authorization to throw away. A few rooms held broken furniture, chairs with missing legs, tables with warped surfaces, metal filing cabinets with drawers that wouldn't close. It always smelled damp and musty down there, like wet cement mixed with mildew. The fluorescent lights buzzed constantly and flickered when they worked at all. A lot of the time, you had to bring a flashlight just to navigate because half the bulbs were burned out and maintenance never seemed to get around to replacing them. When I first started the job, one of the older custodians, a guy named Frank who'd been there for over 20 years, pulled me aside during my first week. "Avoid the basement unless you absolutely have to go down there," he said. "It's not worth the trouble." I asked him what he meant and he just shrugged and said, "Place gives me the creeps." Some of the guys joked that it's haunted. I laughed it off at the time, but even in that first week, I noticed how uneasy I felt whenever I had to go down there. It was like stepping into a completely different world compared to the bright, relatively modern hallways upstairs. There were nights when I'd pass the door to the basement stairwell and feel a chill just from looking at it, even though the door was closed and there was no draft. Most nights, I didn't have to go down there, so I avoided it whenever possible. I'd find excuses to skip basement tasks, tell my supervisor they could wait until the weekend when there were more people working. But one night, about 2 years into the job, I didn't have a choice. I came in for my shift and found a task list taped to my cleaning cart. Most of it was the usual stuff: empty trash, mop hallways, clean bathrooms. But one item made my stomach sink: bring up folding chairs from basement storage for assembly tomorrow. I groaned audibly. The only place those chairs were kept was in one of the basement storage rooms, and there was no way around it. I remember standing at the top of the basement stairwell for a solid minute, just staring at the door, debating whether I could call my supervisor and ask if it could wait until morning. But I didn't want to look lazy or scared, so I grabbed my flashlight from the cart and pulled the heavy door open. The stairwell was concrete with metal railings, and it echoed with every step I took. My boots sounded way too loud, each footfall bouncing off the walls and traveling down into the darkness below. I reached the bottom and flipped the light switch. Only a couple of the overhead fluorescents came on, leaving most of the hallway shrouded in shadow. The ones that did work flickered and buzzed like dying insects. I swear it smelled like wet concrete and rust down there, thick and stale, the kind of smell that gets in your throat. I turned on my flashlight and started walking. The chairs were supposed to be in the second storage room on the left. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness. illuminating dust particles floating in the air. The first room I passed was full of old desks piled precariously to the ceiling. The second door was partially rusted, and it squealed like nails on a chalkboard when I pulled it open. Inside, the room smelled like dust and old wood polish. The folding chairs were stacked against the far wall in uneven piles, some leaning dangerously. I bent down and started pulling them out, trying to carry as many as I could at once so I wouldn't have to make multiple trips. I had just picked up 4 chairs, balancing them awkwardly in my arms, when I froze completely. From somewhere out in the hallway, I heard a soft dragging sound, like someone was slowly sliding their shoe across the concrete floor. I held my breath, still bent over with the chairs in my arms, listening as hard as I could. The sound stopped. I straightened up slowly and peeked my head out into the hallway, shining my flashlight in both directions. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just empty corridor and closed doors. My heart was thumping loudly in my ears. I stood there for what felt like forever before finally telling myself it was probably just the pipes settling, or maybe I'd shifted a chair against the floor without realizing it. I carried the first load out into the hallway and headed toward the stairs. As I walked, I suddenly felt a cold draft against my face, strong enough to make me stop mid-step. The sensation was so out of place that it made my skin prickle. The basement was always warm and stale, with no windows and no ventilation. The air never moved. This felt like standing next to an open freezer. I shined my flashlight up and down the hallway, but nothing looked different. No doors standing open. No vents blowing air. I shook it off, set the chairs down at the bottom of the stairwell and went back for more. When I walked into the storage room again, something felt wrong. The stack of chairs looked different somehow, like they'd shifted position while I was gone. I frowned at them, trying to remember exactly how they'd been arranged. Had that yellow chair been on top? Or had it been further down in the stack? I finally told myself I was just being paranoid, and I picked up another load. This time, as I turned to leave the room, I heard it again. A distinct thump, followed by a slow scraping sound. It came from farther down the basement hallway, from the direction I'd been avoiding. My flashlight beam shook slightly in my hand as I aimed it toward the sound. About 20 feet down the corridor, one of the old classroom doors that I knew had been closed tight was now standing open. Just slightly, maybe 6 inches, but definitely open. My stomach dropped. I knew I hadn't touched that door. I hadn't even walked in that direction. And the school was supposed to be locked up tight at night. No one else should be down here. I stood frozen in the doorway of the storage room, staring at that partially open door. Every instinct I had screamed at me to drop the chairs and run upstairs immediately. But I just stood there, paralyzed, trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe the door had come loose on its own. Old hinges. Or maybe when I'd opened the storage room, the change in air pressure had pushed it open. I clung to those rationalizations like they were the only things keeping me sane. I carried the chairs quickly to the stairwell, my pace much faster than before. Then I came back, flashlight in hand, no chairs this time. I had to check that door. I had to know. The partially open door was still there, unchanged. The gap seemed to stare at me like a dark eye. My throat had gone completely dry. I crept toward it slowly, each step echoing unnaturally loud in the empty basement. When I was about 5 feet away, I forced myself to speak. "Hello? Is anyone down here?" My voice cracked. It sounded small and pathetic in the vast emptiness. No answer. Just the hum of the few working fluorescent lights and the distant gurgle of pipes. I swallowed hard, then pushed the door open fast with my free hand, simultaneously shining the flashlight inside. The room was empty. Just metal shelves packed with dusty science equipment. Beakers, old microscopes, boxes of glass slides. Cobwebs stretched across the corners. Everything covered in a thick layer of undisturbed dust. I stepped inside for just a second, heart absolutely racing, listening for any sound at all. That's when I heard it again. The dragging shuffle, that same sound from before. But this time it was behind me, in the hallway, right where I'd just been standing. I spun around so fast I nearly dropped the flashlight, the beam swinging wildly as I pointed it down the corridor. Nothing. Just shadows and concrete and closed doors. But I felt it. That unmistakable, heavy pressure you get when you absolutely know, you're being watched. My skin prickled all over. Every hair on my arm stood up. I didn't care about the chairs anymore. I didn't care about finishing the task or looking professional or any of it. I backed up slowly, keeping the flashlight aimed down the hallway, and made my way as quickly as I dared toward the stairwell. When I reached the stairs, I grabbed the chairs I'd already brought up and took them 2 steps at a time, not stopping until I burst through the door into the main hallway upstairs. I was gasping for breath, leaning against the wall, sweating despite the fact that the school was cold. I stood there for several minutes trying to calm down, telling myself I'd imagined things. That it had been rats or water pipes or the building settling. But I couldn't explain the door. I couldn't explain why it had been closed when I first walked past, and then suddenly standing open. I couldn't explain the dragging footsteps that seemed to follow me. I locked the stairwell door behind me, even though I wasn't technically supposed to lock interior doors, and I didn't go back down for the rest of the night. The chairs would have to wait. About a week later, I was mopping the hallway directly above the basement stairs. It was around 2 a.m. and I was the only person in the building. I heard it again. 3 loud bangs. Evenly spaced. Like someone hitting the wall with their fist. Bang. 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 The mop slipped out of my hand, clattering to the floor. Water splashed across the freshly cleaned tiles. I stood completely frozen, listening with every fiber of my being. Then I heard the basement door rattle violently, like someone had shoved it hard from the other side, trying to force it open. My blood went cold. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I didn't open the door. I didn't investigate. I just stood there gripping the mop handle like it was a weapon until the sound finally stopped. After that night, I refused to go down into the basement alone. If anything needed to come up from down there, I'd wait until another custodian was on shift and ask them to come with me. I never told the other guys exactly what I'd experienced. I knew they'd either laugh it off or feed into the ghost story mythology that already surrounded the place. But I know what I felt. I know what I heard. To this day, when I think about those slow dragging footsteps in the darkness, about that door standing open when it should have been closed, about something following me through that basement, I feel sick to my stomach. I don't work there anymore. Haven't for 3 years now. But sometimes I still have dreams about it, about being trapped in that basement with the flickering lights and the smell of damp concrete, hearing those footsteps getting closer and closer, knowing I'm not alone down there, knowing something is hunting me in the dark. Story 2. The empty classroom that wasn't empty. I worked as a custodian at a large high school for 3 years. I was the newest guy on the maintenance team, so naturally I got stuck with most of the overnight shifts. Nobody wants to work overnights if they don't have to. The building was massive, 4 floors, 2 gymnasiums, an auditorium, a cafeteria that could seat 400 students. At night, when it was completely empty, it felt like a giant maze. Like something out of a horror movie. The standard procedure was to go floor by floor, room by room, systematically turning off lights, emptying trash cans and locking doors behind you. It usually took the entire night to cover everything properly. If you tried to rush through it, you'd inevitably miss something and hear about it the next day. One Friday night in late October, I was working completely alone because one of the other custodians had called out sick. Normally, we worked in pairs on weekends. There was just too much ground to cover for one person. But the supervisor said they couldn't get anyone to come in on short notice, so I was on my own. At first, the shift seemed normal enough. I started on the first floor, methodically emptying trash cans, wiping down surfaces, and mopping the hallways. The lights in some of the older corridors flickered occasionally, making the shadows jump around in ways that would catch my eye. But I told myself it was just old wiring, just the building settling. Around midnight, I made my way up to the 3rd floor. That floor had always given me an uneasy feeling, even when I was working with other people. It was quieter than the rest of the building somehow. Sound didn't carry the same way. It also had a lot of older classrooms that weren't used anymore during the regular school day. Some were permanently locked. Others had been converted into storage rooms filled with dusty textbooks, broken chairs, and outdated lab equipment. As I walked down the main hallway pushing my cleaning cart, I passed row after row of lockers. The metallic click of the cart wheels and the echo of my boots against the tiles were the only sounds. Every few steps, some small noise would make me jump. A locker door that wasn't quite closed rattling slightly, or the building's heating system kicking on with a low rumble. I kept reminding myself it was normal. Just an old building making old building noises. I was about halfway through mopping one of the main corridors when I noticed something that made me stop dead. A classroom door about 20 feet ahead of me was standing wide open. That immediately struck me as wrong because I had already done a walkthrough of this floor earlier in the evening, around 10:30 p.m., and I'd specifically checked every single door. Every one of them had been locked. I'd tested them personally. My first instinct was to walk past it quickly and pretend I hadn't seen it. Just finish my work and get out of there. But something made me stop. Professional obligation, maybe? Or just morbid curiosity. I leaned my mop against the wall and approached the door slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. It was one of those old wooden classroom doors with a small square window made of reinforced glass. I pushed it open farther, shining my flashlight inside. The room looked empty at first glance. Student desks were stacked along the walls in precarious towers. Cardboard boxes were piled in the corners, their sides sagging with age. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust. Nothing seemed actively wrong or out of place. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. One of the boxes near the back wall had been moved recently. It was tilted at an angle, not lined up with the others, and there were fresh scuff marks on the floor tiles, like someone had dragged the box several feet across the room. I stood in the doorway, flashlight beam trembling slightly in my hand, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I knew, absolutely knew, that I had closed and locked this door earlier, and I knew I hadn't moved that box. I'd never even been inside this particular room before. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe maintenance had come through earlier and I'd missed them somehow. Or maybe a teacher had forgotten something and come back to grab it. But even as I thought those things, I knew they didn't make sense. The school was locked. All the exterior doors were secured. I had the only set of keys for this floor. I pulled the door closed firmly and tested the handle. Locked. I went back to mopping, but my mind kept wandering back to that room. I kept thinking I should check the windows. Maybe a student had somehow broken in, though that seemed unlikely given the security measures. I tried to shake the feeling of being watched and just focused on the rhythmic motion of mopping. Back and forth, back and forth. After finishing that hallway, I headed toward the stairwell to go down to the second floor. My route took me past that same classroom again. My heart nearly stopped. The door was wide open. Again. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I absolutely knew, I had just closed and locked that door less than 10 minutes ago. I approached slowly, every nerve ending on high alert. I peeked inside, shining my flashlight around the room. The box I'd noticed before was now sitting in the center of the floor. Right in the middle of the room, impossible to miss. My pulse was racing so hard I could feel it in my temples. This wasn't my imagination. Something was very wrong. I whispered into the darkness. "Hello? Is someone in here?" My voice sounded tiny and fragile in the emptiness of the building. I waited, holding my breath, listening for any response. Silence. Complete and total silence. And then, from the back corner of the room, from the shadows where my flashlight beam didn't quite reach, I heard it. Slow, deep breathing. Not a draft. Not a pipe. Not the building settling. Someone trying to breathe quietly, but deliberately making just enough sound for me to hear it. My mind immediately tried to rationalize it. A student hiding as a prank. Someone who'd snuck in somehow. But how would they have gotten in? I was the only one with keys to this floor, and all the doors had been locked when I arrived. I didn't wait to figure it out. I slammed the door shut and ran down the hallway to the stairwell as fast as I could, my heart hammering against my ribs. Sweat ran down my back despite the cold air. I stayed pressed against the stairwell door for several minutes, catching my breath, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to just leave, clock out early, get in my car, and drive home. But I also didn't want to lose this job, and abandoning a shift was a firing offense. Finally, I pulled out my phone and called my supervisor. I hated bothering him in the middle of the night, but I didn't know what else to do. When he answered, voice groggy with sleep, I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained what was happening. The open door. The moved box. The breathing. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he finally said. "Stay in the stairwell. Don't go near that room." Those 20 minutes felt like 20 hours. I sat on the concrete steps, staring at the door that led back to the third floor, half expecting it to slowly swing open at any moment. When my supervisor finally arrived, he had a heavy-duty flashlight and walked with the kind of confidence that only comes from years of experience dealing with weird situations in empty buildings. We went back upstairs together. The classroom door was still closed. He pushed it open without hesitating and walked straight in, shining his flashlight into every corner. I stayed in the doorway, too scared to follow him all the way inside. The box was still there in the middle of the floor. We checked everywhere, behind the stacked desks, inside the closets, under the tables. There was nothing. No one. My supervisor examined the windows. All locked from the inside. He checked for any other exits. There were none. "You're probably just tired," he said eventually, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "Working alone in a big building like this, your mind can play tricks on you." I didn't argue, but I knew what I'd heard. That slow, deliberate breathing. That wasn't my imagination. He stayed with me for the rest of the shift, which I appreciated. But even with him there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with that room. Every time I passed that classroom, even with my supervisor walking beside me, The hallway felt colder, more oppressive, like the air was heavier. A few weeks later, I was working with another custodian, an older guy named Thomas who'd been there for over a decade. I casually mentioned the incident to him, leaving out the scarier details, just asking if he knew anything about that particular classroom. His expression changed immediately. "Room 347?" he asked. I nodded. "Yeah, don't go in there alone," he said matter-of-factly. "Years ago, maybe 10-15 years back, a student got caught hiding in that room overnight. Snuck in after school to play some kind of prank. Scared the hell out of the staff. They stopped using it as a regular classroom after that. That should have explained everything. Should have made me feel better. But it didn't explain the breathing I'd heard. There was no one else in that school that night. I was absolutely certain of that. I finished out my time at that school, but I took every precaution I could think of. I made sure to lock doors behind me as I passed. I kept my flashlight pointed ahead at all times. If I had to work the third floor, I stayed as far away from room 347 as possible. Even months later, the memory of that breathing, slow and deliberate, coming from a room that should have been empty, still makes my skin crawl. I quit that job almost a year ago and moved to a different city for unrelated reasons. But sometimes I still think about that classroom. About the box that moved on its own. About the sound of someone breathing in the darkness. And I wonder if the next custodian who works that third floor alone has heard it too. Story 3. The Voice in the Auditorium. I worked as a night custodian at an old high school for 2 years. The worst part of the job, the part that filled me with dread every single shift, was always cleaning the auditorium. It was massive. 3 levels of seating, main floor, mezzanine, and balcony, all surrounding a large stage with heavy velvet curtains that hung from ceiling-mounted tracks. During the day, when the space was full of students rehearsing plays or attending assemblies, it looked normal, almost welcoming. But at night, when the building was empty and you were alone in there, it felt like stepping into a completely different place. Like you'd crossed some invisible threshold into somewhere you weren't supposed to be. Even with all the lights on, there were shadows in every corner that seemed darker than they should be. The kind of shadows that your eyes keep drifting back to, trying to determine if something moved. Sound carried strangely in there too. If you dropped a broom, the echo would stretch and bounce off the walls in ways that made it impossible to tell exactly where the original sound had come from. Your footsteps would echo with a slight delay, like someone was walking behind you, matching your pace. Most nights, I saved the auditorium for last because I genuinely hated going in there. There was just something about it that always made my skin crawl, an oppressive feeling I couldn't shake or explain. Near the end of winter one year, February I think, I had to clean the auditorium earlier than usual because there was going to be a play performance the next morning and the drama teacher had specifically requested that everything be spotless. I arrived at the auditorium around midnight, dragging my cleaning cart behind me. The side entrance door creaked loudly as I opened it, and when it slammed shut behind me, the echo traveled across the entire empty space like a gunshot. I started by sweeping the aisles between the seats. The chairs in this auditorium were old, a mix of metal folding seats bolted to the floor in some sections and loose wooden seats in others. The constant scraping sound of my broom echoed off the walls and the vaulted ceiling. After a few minutes, I thought I heard something else beneath the sound of my own sweeping. It was faint at first, a soft rustling like fabric moving, like curtains swaying even though there was no breeze. The sound seemed to be coming from the stage. I stopped sweeping and looked up. The stage was empty, just some stacked props in the corners and the heavy curtains hanging motionless. I shook my head and told myself it was nothing. Old building, strange acoustics. I'd probably just heard my own jacket rustling and the echo made it sound like it came from somewhere else. I continued sweeping. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time more distinct. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the stage. I froze completely, broom handle gripped tight in both hands, staring at the stage. Nothing was moving. The props were still stacked in their corners. The curtains hung perfectly still. But I knew what I'd heard. Footsteps. Clear as day. Walking across the wooden stage floor with that distinctive hollow sound. My breathing became shallow. I slowly climbed the steps at the side of the stage, shining my flashlight into the wings, the areas behind the curtains where actors waited for their entrances. There were ropes and pulleys everywhere. Old chairs stacked against the walls. Painted scenery pieces leaning in corners. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the beam of my flashlight made the particles dance in the air like they were alive. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was nearby, watching me, waiting. I backed off the stage carefully, telling myself it was just the building settling. Maybe a mouse in the rafters. Maybe the heating system causing the wood to expand. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I continued sweeping the aisles, trying to work as quickly as possible. My mind kept going back to the stage, to those footsteps I'd heard. They replayed in my head over and over, even though I couldn't hear them anymore. I finished sweeping the main floor and started mopping. As I pushed the mop through the rows of seats, working my way methodically from back to front, I thought I saw a shadow move across the second tier of seating. Just a flicker at the edge of my vision. I jerked my head up and shined the flashlight toward the mezzanine level. The beam swept across rows of empty seats, catching dust in the air. Nothing there. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, shadows cast by my own flashlight as I moved. But my hands were shaking now, and I kept my back to the wall as I worked, unable to shake the feeling that someone was behind me. I was nearly finished mopping the main floor when I heard it. A whisper. Soft, indistinct, I couldn't make out any words. But it was definitely a voice. Low and raspy. And it was coming from somewhere above me. From the balcony. My heart started hammering so hard I thought it might burst. The flashlight beam trembled violently in my hands as I aimed it upward at the balcony seats. Nothing. Just rows of empty seats disappearing into shadow. I wanted to run. Every instinct I had screamed at me to drop the mop and sprint for the exit. But I couldn't. I had to finish the job. I'd get written up if I left it incomplete, and I couldn't afford to lose this position. I kept mopping, moving faster now, my ears straining to catch any sound. The whispering continued, so quiet I could almost convince myself I was imagining it, but present enough that I knew I wasn't. It seemed to be moving, getting closer, descending from the balcony to the mezzanine. I tried calling out, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice sounded weak and pathetic in the huge space. There was no answer. Just the echo of my own voice bouncing back at me, and beneath it, that soft whispering. I finished mopping the main floor and forced myself to start cleaning the stage itself. The steps up felt endless, and every time I moved my flashlight I thought I saw something at the edge of the beam. Sometimes it was just a shadow. Sometimes it was my imagination playing tricks. But sometimes, and this is what terrified me, I couldn't tell what it was. When I reached the stage, I looked out over the empty auditorium. The rows of seats stretched back into darkness. I shined my flashlight up at the balcony, and for just a moment, just a split second, I thought I saw a figure sitting there. Just a silhouette. A dark shape in one of the seats. I blinked and it was gone. I told myself it was a coat someone had left behind, or the way the shadows fell across the seats. But the feeling didn't leave me. The certainty that I was being watched. I started working faster, dusting props and sweeping the stage floor, trying to focus on the physical tasks and block out everything else. The whispering came again. Much clearer this time. Much closer. It sounded like someone speaking my name. Not shouting it. Not calling out. Just saying it softly, almost tenderly. "Daniel?" It came from directly behind me. I spun around so fast that the flashlight slipped in my sweaty hands. I fumbled to catch it, and the beam swung wildly across the stage. Empty. Nothing there. The props were still stacked in the same places. The curtains hadn't moved. But I knew, I absolutely knew, I hadn't imagined that voice. Someone had just said my name. Right behind me. Close enough that I should have felt their breath on my neck. I backed away slowly, heart racing, moving toward the side exit. I reached the edge of the stage and stopped, listening. And then I heard them. Soft footsteps on the upper levels. Moving slowly across the balcony. Stopping and starting like someone pacing back and forth. Like someone watching me from above and trying to decide what to do next. I told myself it was impossible. The auditorium was locked. All the doors were secured from the inside. No one else should have been there. But the footsteps continued. Slow and deliberate. Crossing the balcony, then descending to the mezzanine. Coming closer. I didn't think anymore. I just ran. I sprinted to the side door, grabbed the handle and pulled it open. The cold night air hit me like a physical blow, and I gasped, stumbling out into the hallway. I could still hear it. The faint echo of footsteps from inside the auditorium. Moving down to the main floor now. Following the path I'd just taken. I slammed the door shut and locked it with shaking hands. Then I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, feeling sweat running down my face despite the cold. I didn't go back inside that night. The auditorium would have to stay the way it was. The next morning, I tried to tell another custodian what had happened. He just laughed and said, "It's an old building, man. Probably just settling or something. Acoustics are weird in there too, sound bounces around in strange ways." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But he hadn't heard his name whispered in an empty auditorium. He hadn't heard those footsteps pacing above him, deliberately matching his movements. A few weeks later, I overheard a conversation between two drama teachers. They were talking about the history of the auditorium, and one of them mentioned that years ago, maybe 20 years back, a drama teacher had died suddenly right there. Heart attack. Collapsed on stage in the middle of a rehearsal with students present. The other teacher said some people claimed you could still hear him walking the stage at night. That sometimes people heard whispers in the seats during late-night rehearsals. I tried to convince myself it was just a story. Urban legend. The kind of thing people make up about old buildings. But I couldn't forget the way that voice had said my name. The way those footsteps had followed me, descending from the balcony, crossing the mezzanine, moving down to the main floor. The way I'd seen that figure sitting in the balcony, just for a moment, before it disappeared. After that night, I refused to clean the auditorium alone. If it was on my task list, I'd wait until another custodian was available to work with me, or I'd trade tasks with someone else. I quit that job about 6 months later. Told them I was moving to be closer to family, which was partially true. But the real reason was that auditorium. The feeling I got every time I walked past it, even during the day when other people were in the building. That cold pressure in the air. That certainty that something was in there. Something that knew my name. I haven't worked as a custodian since. I got a job at a warehouse. Day shift only, bright lights, lots of people around. But sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to fall asleep, I hear it again in my memory. That soft whisper saying my name. Those slow footsteps crossing an empty stage. And I absolutely know, that whatever was in that auditorium is still there. Still pacing the balcony. Still whispering names into the darkness. Still waiting for the next person who has to clean that space alone at night. 3 custodians. 3 empty buildings. 3 experiences that defy rational explanation. I want to thank everyone who shared their stories with me. Working overnight in empty schools requires a special kind of courage, and experiencing something you can't explain while doing that job is something that stays with you forever. If you work as a custodian or in any job that leaves you alone in large buildings at night, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't investigate strange sounds alone. Don't dismiss that feeling of being watched. These stories are real. They happen to real people who were just trying to do their jobs. If you found value in tonight's episode, please like and subscribe. Share these stories with someone who needs to hear them. And if you work a night shift in an empty building, stay safe. Stay alert. And remember, you might not be as alone as you think. Until next time.